This is Chorus, an arcadey space shooter that's promising to be a sort of an evolution on the genre, and I do see what they mean because it does some things a bit different than you might be used to for this sort of idea. So what exactly is Chorus? This is not a space sim, this is not like the X games, this is more like, say, Free Space or something like that. It is an arcadey space shooter set in a pretty open world with lots of side quests in various different sectors to warp to. And it's also very heavily story-based. There are actually all sorts of cutscenes and different memories and lore you can find. The story for this game is actually kind of interesting, in my opinion, and it is very well presented with all of these cutscenes and optional memory fragments you can find and things of that nature. And it makes for a linear but interesting adventure through these areas that expand out to be less linear when you're in each one, each sector being sort of a hub that'll have several different story missions in it to complete, as well as a large selection of side quests and stuff to explore and find until you move on to the next hub. But the main thing that this game does differently, aside from the very heavy story focus, is the combat. Being an arcadey space shooter, it is very combat focused, again, sort of like Free Space or something of that nature. However, it does pretty much exactly the opposite of what a lot of these games tend to do. A lot of space games focus on very long distance engagements, right? You'll have missiles that can lock on at 6 kilometers away, and main laser batteries that can hit at 2.5 kilometers out, and things like that. And space battles are effectively naval battles with the extra dimension of being able to move around in space. But this game does it completely differently and focuses entirely on very short-range skirmishes. You have a suite of psychic powers as well as a couple of different weapons, and all of them are focused around this idea of fighting at very close range. All of the movement and controls are based on close range. Everything in this game is meant to be used at a sort of close range, fast and frantic level. Pretty much all of your engagements are going to be happening at like below 1 kilometer away, so everything is right up in your face. You have 3 different weapons to choose from, each of which you can have just one equipped at any given time, so you can cycle between all 3. You have a laser, which does not work like a traditional space laser, being like a constant beam that you keep trained on the target. Instead, it is a very heavy damage burst that takes a while before it can fire again. It acts more like a sniper rifle, kind of. You also have a minigun that can actually be a lot of different things. There are different varieties of miniguns. Some fire fast, some fire in short 4-shot bursts and things like that, but these are sort of your bread and butter kinetic weapons. And then you have missiles, which are actually more like rockets, because most of them are dumbfire, although there's quite a bit of variety in missiles as well, including things like cluster missiles and some other like delayed torpedoes and things like that too that can go in this slot. And you also have your rights, which are various psychic powers that are effectively space magic. These rights include things like a pulse that just tells you where things are. It's useful for finding hidden collectibles and other things like that, although it can also be used in combat to highlight ships that may be behind something in order to help you find them. You've also got things like a lightning burst that actually shoots out a bolt of lightning that's extremely good at taking down shields on heavily shielded targets, and also will cause them to just sort of spin out like you hit them with an EMP effectively. And you've got some more advanced stuff too, like the ability to blink. You can actually blink directly behind a target from quite a distance away, allowing you to engage them right close up in your face. And there's even an upgrade to this right that makes it amplify your weapon damage by 50%, allowing you to basically just quick backstab something in order to take it out like an assassination move. Later on, you can even get the ability to do things like turn yourself into like a rushing comet that actually punches through everything it hits for a sort of short-range bull rush attack that's very powerful but takes a lot of your energy to use. However, the main right that most of the combat and controls is actually focused around is the drift. Yes, space drifting. It works exactly like you think. Basically, as soon as you hold the right mouse button, your ship transforms into this cool drift state, and non-Newtonian physics kick in, allowing you to move all around and rotate in different directions and things while keeping your previous heading. So you can, say, combine it with your ship's boosters to slingshot yourself around corners at various angles, or you can just say boost forward and then turn backwards to hit an enemy that's pursuing you, and then face forwards again and kick the physics back in. It's a really cool system, and it takes a little bit of getting used to because it makes the control scheme for this game very non-standard for this genre. At first, I actually had the complaint that the controls seemed a little bit stilted for me, but after you get your actual ship early on in the game and you get the ability to drift, then I started to understand how this actually works. Because the control scheme for this game is set up around very tight corners and close spaces, you have to use this drift in combination with your boost and stuff to be able to make very, very sharp, like hairpin turns in close range and things like that. So the whole point of the control scheme is to be using this drift constantly to your advantage. It feels a bit strange in this genre at first to not have like a rotation button, or a traditional strafe. You do have a barrel roll that's on the A and D keys, and it actually works kind of like a dodge roll in that it seems to give you some immunity frames, and you're meant to use it at very specific timings to dodge big projectiles and huge laser attacks and things like that. It's actually pretty satisfying, and it even gives you a little bit of cinematic slowdown when you nail the timing just right. But once you realize that the drift is basically your 6 degrees of freedom button, and while you're holding the right mouse button down, you basically have like 6 degrees of freedom style controls until you release the button again, then you sort of realize how the control scheme for this game actually works. This does mean that people that go into this game looking for a more traditional, like free space, Starlancer maybe kind of experience might be put off by the control scheme, but I think it's actually worth trying to get used to sort of play it for a little bit to see if you can get used to the controls, because once it actually clicks, it's really fun. And kicking around corners with this sort of non-Newtonian flight mode and then engaging the physics again at various angles to shoot all sorts of weird, crazy angles all at once and stuff like that, all while boosting forward, is a really cool feeling, actually. And although it does take some time to get used to, I think that my complaints about the control scheme for this game were pretty much entirely solved by the addition of that drift and by the extra addition of things like that big star boost and the blink that you have. Basically, you have to combine all of your various psychic powers together to actually maneuver most effectively, and you actually get torn to shreds in this game if you don't use them effectively, because you are very, very squishy. You will constantly be outnumbered and outgunned in this game, and even with several hull and shield upgrades, you cannot take very much damage. It will pretty much always just be you. You don't have like AI companions most of the time or anything like that, so you'll be facing off against some pretty significant swarms of enemies that are going to be able to do a lot more damage than you and take a lot more damage than you, so it's all up to you to use this control scheme to actually be extremely agile and just zip all over the place like a crazy person in order to actually survive. That's how the combat of this game works. You have to be a gnat and just sort of zoom all around the place at very high speeds, taking super sharp turns around asteroids and hairpin turns around space stations and things like that in order to actually get in the right position to outmaneuver all of your enemies before taking too much damage. The world itself that you have to explore is pretty simple for the most part, but it does have some standout areas like the temples that are made out of this crazy red crystal, and some anomalies and things where gravity doesn't work right, and some wormholes and some other things like that. So there are some visually interesting areas, but a lot of it is asteroid fields, space stations, derelicts, things like that, the kind of thing that you would really expect from a game set in space like this. But exploration is very well rewarded because there are tons of side quests to do, and they can give you anything from a fragment of hull or shield upgrade, collect 3 of each fragment to fully upgrade your hull or shield, and also some money, of course, because you can dock at stations and buy new weapons and new modifiers for your ship. Of course, you can also get some of those extra gadgets to modify your ship with. You have 3 different slots that you can fill up, and there are even set bonuses on certain things that activate different bonuses at 2 and 4 pieces of equipment of that set. I've noticed that the set bonuses are rare, but tend to be extremely powerful. One of the earliest set bonuses you'll be able to complete, if you get all 4 pieces, your miniguns will no longer overheat at all, and you can fire them as long as you want, which is sort of a big deal. And there are later set bonuses, including things like increasing your right energy, so you can use more rights at a time, and making them deal a ton more damage, so that it makes you sort of, basically you're a glass cannon in this game anyway, but it makes you even more of a glass cannon. Some other rewards from side quests include things like right fragments, which every 3 of those you collect, you get 1 extra bar of right energy so that you can use more of them in combat more quickly. You can also find the rare, but very nice to have right upgrades, which actually add some sort of powerful passive effect to each right. So, for instance, the one for the blink that I mentioned that makes your weapons 50% stronger for a couple seconds after you blink. The one for the lightning actually makes you overcharge your own shields by the amount of shield you took down on enemies, so it vastly increases your survivability in combat, which is super useful. You can also occasionally find some rare and exotic forms of the different 3 weapons that allow you to have a bit of a different progression from the normal, more linear progression that you can buy in shops. There's a much less linear and more interesting progression of weapons that you can actually get a hold of once you start doing these side quests. So I like the fact that there are a lot of different rewards for side quests and that they're all really genuinely very useful and powerful. This means that it feels that your exploration is very well rewarded most of the time, and then once you're done with the side quests or whenever you want, you can go to the next story mission and do that. And the story missions tend to be pretty long, quite large, and often have multiple phases, sometimes even jumping you between multiple systems. Often either culminating in a new rite for you to perform by getting it in a new temple, or in a very large combat in some sort of big climactic battle. Either way, that's the main gameplay loop of Chorus. It's actually quite simple. There is no mining, no real economy for trade or anything like that. It is an entirely combat-focused, arcadey space experience. You know, not a sim, just space combat. That's what this game does. But I think it does it quite well. I think its focus on tight scenarios and very close range combat is actually to its advantage, because that's pretty rare in this sort of genre, and I think the controls of the game, although they take a bit of getting used to, do lend themselves very well to this style of movement. As another example, you know how most space games have that sublight travel mode that's like faster than your ship's boost, but slower than an actual warp, and it tends to take lateral control away from you, so you can't really turn very quickly or anything. You just have to sort of point towards your destination and go like space trucker mode. This game does have a sublight travel system, but you're actually encouraged to still move around while you're using it, because you keep fine control of your ship while going that fast. And in fact, there are actually some story missions where you have to chase people around asteroid fields and things while actually maneuvering in this sublight travel mode. So I think that should show you what I mean by how this game is focused on like tight maneuvering and small spaces and things like that, because even its main like fast travel mode still has fine control of your ship that allows you to weave in and out of asteroid fields and around destroyed bases and things like that in a way that's actually pretty cinematic and satisfying. One of my biggest problems with the game, however, is the fact that the game's difficulty is really inconsistent. It seems that any given combat encounter will either be very easy or like incredibly ball-bustingly hard, and there's like no middle ground most of the time. You very rarely get a sort of moderately challenging encounter. It seems that it's mostly either super easy, do it with your eyes closed, or retry it 5 times before you're finally able to do it. And I think what this mostly comes down to is the fact that you're very squishy, like I mentioned. So the difficulty of an average combat encounter really heavily depends on what sorts of different enemies it spawns. This game actually has quite a lot of enemy variety to it, so exactly what combination of different things it spawns is going to determine how easy it actually is to deal with some later game combinations of enemies being crushingly difficult at some points because of the like instant hit lasers that can take off like 3/4 of your health in one blast, combined with these huge swarms that you have to kill in very specific ways. Basically, if it mixes in a bunch of the more basic enemies that you can just shoot down, it's not that hard, but as soon as it starts mixing in some of the larger ships or the swarm enemies that have specific ways of taking them down other than just shooting them, so you have to worry about your rights usage and things like that, that suddenly makes things a lot harder, because you have to split your attention between shooting down the fodder and then like lightning striking and attacking the heavier ships, all while not getting hit very much because you're so squishy. You have to sort of fly in and out, weaving in between these big clouds of enemies, trying to slowly take them apart without getting hit too much. One of my favorite parts, though, is actually related to this, and that there are some very large ships that it will teleport in sometimes for you to fight, and those are actually really cool because of the game's focus on very close-range combat. You actually have to go into these ships and destroy things on the walls and destroy turrets and power generators and things like that to actually take them down piece by piece from the inside and then fly out as they explode. And I think that's actually the height of the game's combat system, is when you're taking apart these big ships piece by piece by being an annoying gnat flying around them at super high speed, avoiding all their laser bursts and just taking them to pieces. That's really satisfying, and I think that is when the game best understands that its control scheme is fit for this sort of thing exactly. In addition to the very inconsistent and sometimes kind of crushing difficulty, I have noticed the game has a tendency to suddenly spring things on you in a way that will cause you to fail almost every time until you know what's going on. As in, like, it gives you very little time to react to a new objective change before it suddenly just fails you, like 4 seconds in, and you had no idea what was actually going on, and then you'll respawn in a point where it's much more obvious what's actually happening. There are several different points in this game that I can think of where it suddenly transitioned to a chase scene, or suddenly transitioned to a scene where I had to dive into something or die from a big energy wave, and then I didn't really realize what was happening, but it only gave me like 2 or 3 seconds to actually process the instructions on screen before it just boom failed. And then by the time I restarted again, I sort of got what I was actually supposed to do. There are several moments in the game like that where it seems to expect a little bit too much of you by giving you like 3 seconds to react to a sudden change that you weren't expecting before you just fail all of a sudden and have to try it over again. So that's sort of what I mean by inconsistent difficulty. It's not an overarching problem that affects like every aspect of the game and makes it unplayable or anything, but it does mean that certain parts of the game are suddenly way harder than other parts, and then it just goes right back down again for no reason to being relatively easy. It's just kind of weird. I will say that that's probably the biggest problem that the game actually has, is the fact that its overall difficulty is just very strange and all over the place at times. But even though the difficulty detracts from it a little bit in terms of how inconsistent it is still a very fun experience, and I would actually recommend it for people that really like space shooters. It is pretty casual, you could say, even though it gets quite hard at times, because it doesn't involve like a lot of economy management or anything like that you would think of in like an actual space sim. It's just focused on the combat, but its focus on combat is well done, and it uses this cool movement system, the drifting, and all of your various psychic powers to the benefit of this close-range skirmish idea, which is actually pretty novel in my opinion for a space game. So that's Chorus. I actually enjoyed it. The link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you would like to check it out. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.